Hey guys, I am Caleb with Nebraska Farm Boy. Thanks for joining me on another edition of Farm Boy in 30 Minutes. I am doing well, thank you for asking as always. Not a lot happening in my life. I just got back from traipsing all over the hills collecting flowers. You probably have a question. The answer is no, whatever your question was. No, I was digging out thistles. They're everywhere. Definitely reminded me of the early chapters of Genesis, and I said, Great-Grandpa Adam, you knew you shouldn't have ate that apple. There's thorns and thistles all over the place. Anyways, what we've got for today is a question. Well, it's not a question. I made up the question. It's just that I know that a lot of people ask this question, and I want to give my 2 cents on the question. The problem is the question's flawed. And the question is it okay for young men to plan for marriage? Or specifically Christian young men. You know, the culture at large doesn't really appreciate marriage very much. Christians, however, tend to not appreciate marriage very much. They say that it would be far better for you to go and be a single missionary in Africa because that's more holy because the Apostle Paul said so, which is not true. See, here's the problem with the question. Is it okay? You should never ask that as a Christian. You should never ask if something's okay. See, the Bible doesn't tell you what's okay. It tells you what's right, tells you what's wrong. It tells you what you must do, what you must not do. So God help you if you don't do that, okay? So, in other words, you don't get to choose. God chooses. Your life is Christ's. You don't just go around messing with that. You don't do things for yourself anymore. You have been made captive to Christ. My entire life is a calling. Now that sounds like slavery to some people. Well, it is slavery. However, if you aren't a slave to Christ, you're going to be a slave to yourself, which is even worse. Far even worse. No. There's nothing bad about being a slave to Christ. There's everything bad about being a slave to yourself. I'm sorry, every time I move, this horse trailer rocks. I'm trying to find a place out of the wind and away from my brother and my dad who are trimming right now, and there's just noise everywhere, so you're just gonna have to deal with it. Anyways, I was talking about callings. You're gonna have to be a slave to something, so you might as well choose to be a slave to Christ. Okay, I'm assuming that we're talking mainly to believers here in this video, so I'm not gonna, push that too much. However, I think that there's a lot of Christians who claim to be Christians, but they don't live according to their calling. Like they understand that they're supposed to do certain things and not do certain things, but they don't understand that that Christ's death and atonement that was not just for your sins, okay? It was a renewing of the entire creation, which means that He's renewed every facet of your life, which means that every detail of your life now belongs to Christ, which means that you're going to serve Him with every possible detail, okay? So we don't ask the question, is it okay? We ask, what must we be doing in order to be following the calling that Christ has for us? Now, I can't answer that question for you because God is going to have a calling for each of us, and it's going to be different for each of us, right? However, I want to give you a pointer. A lot of people want to say that singleness is more Christian than getting married, because the Apostle Paul says that he wishes that all could be like him. Apostle Paul was single. He had the gift of celibacy. Now, I want you to know something that I said there. He had a gift, a spiritual gift. God doesn't give the same spiritual gifts to everyone, which means that if you don't have the gift of celibacy, forbid it, Almighty God, if that you would act like you do. It's just as heretical as if you didn't have the gift of prophecy, but you decide to prophesy anyway. Say, I have a word from the Lord to you, and you didn't. That's heretical. The Bible says that such people should be stoned. That's obviously in the old covenant. I'm not going to go stone you if you've done that. I'm just saying that that's how serious the Bible takes these kind of things. You don't take a spiritual gift and try to apply it to everybody, because if you do that, you're actually going against God. What did God say in the beginning? He said that it's not good for man to be alone. That establishes that the ordinary structure of life, that the ordinary calling of a man is to get married, and that what God says is good. You be very, very careful calling bad, okay? What the Apostle Paul was getting at was that he had a calling, and that he lived out his calling, and that each person is to live out their calling, okay? If you're called to be married, then then you must be married, or you must live in a way to prepare yourself for marriage. That's what I meant. If your calling isn't to get married, which I would argue that very, very few people are called to not get married. I mean, how many people do we see in the New Testament not called to get married? Paul and Barnabas, and Paul and Barnabas, and Paul and Barnabas. Like, there's really nobody else besides those two, and there's probably others. There's different people who are mentioned. It doesn't say their marital status, but there's just the overwhelming majority of Christians in the Bible were married, which just means that those Christians are saying it's more Christian to be single. It's nothing short of heresy, because it's more Christian to follow your calling. It can be unchristian to be a preacher. If you're not called to be a preacher, then God forbid that you be a preacher, because you're going against God. That's not going to be successful, okay? But if God's called you to be married, if you try to go against that, that's not going to work out well for you at all, okay? Now, when I say this, I also don't want you to think that what I'm saying is that now you have to go in search of a wife, because a lot of you guys are young, like myself, but that's not what we're doing here. What I'm talking about is preparing for marriage. I mean, God forbid that you would go and look for a wife before you were ready to be a husband, okay? That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about preparing. So would I say that it's okay for young men to prepare for marriage? Well, since I believe that most young men are called to get married, I would say, God forbid that they don't. I would say, so help me God, that's what I'm going to do, because that's my calling. And yeah, it's not about whether it's okay. It's about what it's about necessity. But perhaps you're not convinced quite yet. I would like to give you 3 reasons why, or maybe you are convinced. You just need a little encouragement, because, okay, I want to give you 3 reasons why I prepare myself for marriage. Okay, and I feel like every young man wants to hear this. This is stuff that I wanted to hear, and I mean, like, if I had been born into a slightly different family, I probably wouldn't have heard this stuff. Thankfully, by the grace of God, I do have a very good family. I've been under the influence of very good preaching. I've found it, online or wherever. And that's really encouraged me to be the person that I am. And I just really feel for all those guys who haven't had that opportunity, who haven't ever been encouraged to actually prepare for marriage, because I think I just think it's a crying shame. So basically, I have 3 reasons. There's 3 reasons that push me to prepare for marriage. First of all is my calling. So I already touched on this. My life is captive to Christ. I must live for Christ or I die, because that's just that's just the way it is. Like, sometimes I get so tired of trying to argue with like an atheist or something, because they want me to prove the existence of God. And it's like, it's not that I can't prove the existence of God. It's I can't, because you can't make an atheist believe. Only by the grace of God will they believe. But it's like, it's so obvious to me that it's like, I don't even want to try to prove it, because it's just so like my life is completely saturated by a desire to follow Christ. And I haven't always been that way. I wasn't born a Christian. It's been a gradual progression. There was a point at which I was saved. There was a point at which I really started taking my Christianity seriously. It's just so blatantly obvious through my calling that what I believe is true. You could call me insane, but I'm the happiest man alive, so I guess I'll be insane. You'll find out someday. I'm sorry. So anyways, but again, this isn't exactly, you probably if you're still watching, you probably are a believer, and I probably don't need to convince you of the existence of God. Anyways, the point is, the reason I prepare for marriage is because I believe very, very strongly that I've been called to prepare for marriage, to be married. Like, I there's never been even a doubt in my mind that I'm called to be married. And it's like anything else. Like, I also feel that I'm called to go into law enforcement. I don't like to talk about this very often, because I'm not in law enforcement. I'm too young to join law enforcement, and I don't deserve any credit for wanting to go into law enforcement. The only people who deserve credit are the people who are in law enforcement. Okay, so I'm not trying to get credit for this. I'm just saying, but I'm using this as an example. I feel called to go into law enforcement, and when I had that, when I realized that was where God was calling me. It wasn't like I was ready to go into law enforcement, okay? Obviously I'm still too young, but I realized that there was things that I needed to do to prepare for that. For one thing, I couldn't run a quarter mile when I first realized that God was calling me towards law enforcement. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. And but I'm not gonna just. But here's what I'm getting at. I didn't just sit around waiting for God to miraculously make me able to run more than a quarter mile. No, I got down and I got working, and now by His grace I'm able to run 2 miles. I could run probably more than that. I'm trying to. I haven't arrived. Okay, I'm still working. I always have a higher goal. It's never about arriving. You're never going to arrive. You're always like, and if you do arrive, you set too low of expectations for yourself. Okay, you know, but what I'm trying to say here is it's the same way with marriage. Like, I feel very strongly about my call towards law enforcement, but it's nothing compared to my call towards marriage. Like, and so it's like when I feel like when you have that strong of a calling, the least you can do is prepare for it. The least you're not gonna just sit around and wait for it all to work out. No, you're gonna prepare. You're gonna have the fear of God in you that that you can't like how can you not prepare for something like that? Okay. And it's just the mark of I think that's the mark of a true believer, of a mature believer, that you're going to be more and more just gripped by a desire to be like Christ, to be fulfilling the calling that He has for you. I have 3 values that I live for: God, family, country. I mean, family kind of includes like church and friends and stuff, but like God, family, and country, that's my life, that's my values. God, and my allegiance to God is what gives me my allegiance to family and country. And so it becomes so intertwined that if I were to take that allegiance from family, say, and my commitment to preparing for marriage is part of that allegiance to family, if I were to take that away, it just I can't. You can't separate that. It's just so intertwined in with the rest of my values that it's what my heart beats for. Is to be like Christ, to serve Him, to fulfill the calling that He has for me, and to live for Him in everything. Okay, and when you have a calling like that, don't let anybody dissuade you from pursuing that calling, from working hard to be worthy of that calling. Okay. Second reason why I prepare myself for marriage is that someday I'm going to ask a young lady to marry me, and she deserves a better man than I am now. A lot of what we talk about here is being the man that God's called you to be, and I feel like if you take being the husband, the future husband in my case, and probably in most of you guys' case, the future husband that God has called you to be, out of that equation, it just ruins it. It absolutely ruins it. Like, why do I want to be a man? Like really, like, I feel like my calling as a future husband, as a future father, is my highest calling that God could ever call me to. I feel like that's what the Bible says. I feel like it's a higher calling than being a pastor. It's a higher calling than being a missionary. I wasn't called to be a missionary or a pastor. It would be a disaster if I was. Anyways, getting back to the second point, what I'm saying, like I said, the girl that I marry deserves, or the young lady, the woman, whatever, that I marry deserves better than I am now, than the man that I am now. And also, along with that, that young lady is going to be some man's most prized possession. It's gonna be his life. Her father, she's her father's life. Like, and how dare I just flippantly think that I can go up to him and ask him to marry his daughter if I haven't proven myself a man, if I haven't worked hard towards that goal, towards that end. You know, I'm not going to ever ask a man to court his daughter before I first ask that man for a chance to prove myself to him. And that starts now. Like, that's why I do what I do. Like, that's why I push myself. Is that someday I'm gonna ask a man for permission to prove myself to him, with intentions of someday courting his daughter. So, anyways, of course that's in a perfect scenario. I get it. There's some abusive fathers, but you know, that's the ideal situation. So you have that. I have my calling from God. She deserves better than I am now. And then I also have something. Here's the third one. This is not what you were expecting, because this is not something that you've probably ever been taught. And that is that I have a calling as a brother. And you say, what? Where did that come from? I say, well, look. I have 5 sisters. I love them all to death. I love them all fiercely. I think it's my, like, love, serve, and protect. That's my value statement, and that's my sisters were given to me by God to love, to serve, and to protect. And, you know, on the one hand, there's physical protection. You know, they're kind of what I think of when I'm, slamming the bag, when I'm, my elbow's bleeding, but I'm still streaking blood across that bag because, I'm gonna protect my sisters no matter what it costs. There's some guys who are better fighters than me, but it's gonna take 2 ambulances to drag us out of there. Like, that's just the way that I am. And they aren't helpless. They don't need me. Like, I have a dad. He's a great dad too. Like, I'm just a secondary. But I do think I still have a very strong, a very strong calling, a very strong commitment. So help me God if I don't feel that. But for all of that, I feel like the most important way that I can protect my sisters is by making sure. And again, this doesn't fall solely on me. I have a dad. He's a great dad. Okay, this I'm the secondary. Okay, but by making sure that they marry good men. Like, that's the most important decision, short of coming to salvation, that they can make, right? And I'm not gonna just let them marry just any kind of a man. However, I cannot expect that man to have a higher standard than I hold myself to. And so but I will not settle. Like, I'm not going to let them settle. I'm going to, like, they're going to marry who they're going to marry, and it's not my responsibility to give them in marriage. It's my dad's responsibility, right? But nobody's going to be asking my dad for my sister's hand in marriage if they haven't first, at least lived up to the standard set by the baby brother. Like, I'm serious. Like, at least I can set the lowest standard. At least I can live in such a way that they would be ashamed to marry anyone who was of lesser character than myself. That's my calling. I've got to. I must prepare myself to be the man that I would want my sisters to marry, because I just must, because that's my calling as a protector. It's my calling as a brother. And that's very countercultural. That's very much something that you've probably never heard a preacher say. You've never heard anyone say, but you're hearing a 17-year-old guy say it now. You probably haven't ever heard a 17-year-old guy say most of the things I've said today. And I'm going to be honest, this video has been really awkward for me. I don't usually actually talk like this. I tend to like to be big tough guy. I don't really, but this stuff matters to me. It's my calling. It's what I live for. It's why I work. It's why I train. It's why I do what I do. And if you take that away from a young guy, you've taken everything. You can't do that. So don't let anybody do that to you. Don't let anybody tell you that it's better to be single. Don't let anybody tell you that that marriage is something that you don't need to be worried. You don't need to be concerned about. I mean, I'm very you're going to someday ask some daughter of God to marry her. And that should terrify you, because that's a very serious thing. And so you should be preparing yourself for that. Now, before we go, I just want to give a couple of caveats here. First of all, when I say prepare for marriage, again, I kind of touched on this earlier, but again, what I do not mean is that you should get into a relationship. No, you must prepare yourself for marriage years before you ever get into a relationship, because that's not the purpose of marriage. Is not you. It's not your selfish desires, and it's not so that you're happy, and it's not so that you can have a relationship. It's to the glory of God, and to do anything less is blasphemy. You don't apply first and then prepare later. You prepare first and apply later. And that's why I'm telling you, young guys, like myself, you young guys, I'm not talking down at you. I'm 17, almost 18. But anyways, so, like, I'll just be honest with you. Getting married has been a constant thought on my mind since I was like 12 years old. Not that I have ever gone on a date. Not that I have ever, it's not about who. It's about preparing yourself for marriage. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this is a calling. This is for the glory of God, not for your own pleasure or enjoyment. This is something that you should take very seriously, but it's also something that can bring a lot of joy in preparing for, in growing and growing yourself in. And I guess we should also clarify that when I say prepare yourself for marriage, it doesn't just mean stuff like like, the way you prepare yourself for marriage is by becoming a better man, the man that God has called you to be, a stronger man, a more compassionate man, a more caring man. Learn to love your mother and your sisters long before you ever try to love a stranger. Like, don't marry a stranger, but you know what I mean. She's gonna be a stranger at one point, right? You know, that's how you. There's practical steps that you need to be taking now, and if you don't do that, number one, you're gonna regret it later, and number two, you're just not gonna live as full of a life now as you possibly could. So, anyways, like I said, this video is kind of awkward for me. I've kind of finished. I'm kind of done. I'm 17. Come on, you can only expect so much out of me. See you next time.